They grew up together. Now one is a billionaire and the other is a waiter, until everything changes. Morgan Freeman stepped into the elegant restaurant, the aroma of fine cuisine filling the air. Tonight was meant to be just another business dinner. But then, his eyes landed on the waiter approaching his table. Familiar eyes, a face from the past. A friend who once had the world in his hands, but was now serving tables. Morgan froze. What had happened to him? Does true friendship last beyond success? Comment 1 for yes, 0 for no. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations, silverware clinking against porcelain plates. Morgan Freeman sat at a private table near the back, his assistant flipping through a thick portfolio of documents beside him. "Mr. Freeman, your meal will be out shortly," a crisp voice informed him. He barely acknowledged it, nodding absently while scanning the menu. Then, he heard the voice. "Good evening, sir. I'll be your server tonight." Morgan looked up, and his heart stopped. The man standing before him, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, balancing a tray with steady hands, was Daniel Carter, his childhood best friend, a man who had once been unstoppable, a man who had spoken about dreams of success with fire in his eyes, but now, that fire was gone. Morgan blinked, stunned. "Daniel?" Daniel's grip on the tray tightened. For the briefest second, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, embarrassment, maybe even regret. But it vanished almost as quickly as it came. "Ah, so you do remember me," Daniel said with a strained chuckle. Morgan sat straighter. "What are you doing here?" Daniel shrugged. "Life happens, my friend." Morgan could hear the weight in those two words. And suddenly, his meal didn't seem so important anymore. Morgan had spent years chasing success, but now he was about to learn that true success means never forgetting where you came from. Morgan Freeman had spent a lifetime mastering his presence. Everywhere he went, he commanded attention, not by force, but by the quiet power of his voice, his wisdom, his unshakable aura. But tonight, for the first time in years, he felt small, because sitting across from him was Daniel Carter, the man who had once been his equal, his brother in ambition. And yet, here he was, balancing trays and taking orders like a man who had been forgotten by the world. The sight of it made something tighten in Morgan's chest. For a few long seconds, neither of them spoke. The restaurant buzzed around them, the soft chatter of wealthy diners filling the space. But in Morgan's mind, there was only silence. "You gonna order something or just stare at me all night?" Daniel joked, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Morgan ignored the menu in front of him. "Daniel, what happened to you?" Daniel's shoulders stiffened just for a fraction of a second. But then, just like that, the mask was back. "Nothing happened, Morgan." He gestured around the restaurant. "I work here. It's a job. People have jobs." Morgan leaned forward, studying his friend. "You were supposed to be running a company by now. You had the talent, the drive. Daniel cut him off, his voice flat. "I had plans. Plans change." The weight behind his words was impossible to ignore. Morgan could see it, the way his hands clenched just a little too tight, the exhaustion in his eyes. This wasn't just a job for Daniel. This was defeat, wearing a uniform. Morgan sat back in his chair, the memories flooding in like an unstoppable tide. Late-night study sessions, endless talks about their future, their ambitions. Daniel had been the one person who had believed in Morgan even before the world did. "You told me once," Morgan said, voice quieter now, "that you'd never let life make you small." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Well," he said, forcing out a laugh, "life has a funny way of proving you wrong." Morgan shook his head. "Number. Life throws obstacles. It doesn't decide who you are. You do." Daniel's eyes darkened. "Easy for you to say. You weren't the one who lost everything." Morgan stilled. Daniel set the tray down on the table, his fingers tapping against the surface. "I lost my job, my savings, my home. My mother got sick, the bills kept piling up, and before I knew it, this was the only job I could get." His lips pressed together. "Not everyone gets a second chance, Morgan." Morgan felt the sting of those words, because he knew what Daniel was really saying. You left. You moved on. You had your second chance. But I didn't. Morgan had nothing to say, because what could he say? Daniel had been there for him when he had nothing, and when Daniel had lost everything, Morgan hadn't been there at all. I should have called, Morgan admitted. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It wouldn't have changed anything. Morgan wasn't so sure, because standing in front of him wasn't just an old friend, it was a reminder that no matter how far he had come, how much success he had achieved, some things should never be left behind. Morgan thought success meant moving forward, but tonight he was realizing some journeys require you to turn back. Morgan Freeman sat in silence, his mind turning over Daniel's words like a puzzle with missing pieces. How had this happened? How had a man as brilliant, ambitious, and capable as Daniel Carter fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to reward talent? Morgan had spent decades building his career, securing his legacy. But had he been so focused on moving forward that he had left the most important people behind? The thought unsettled him. Daniel exhaled, looking away as if suddenly aware of how vulnerable he had allowed himself to be. Look, I didn't mean to turn this into some sob story, he muttered, adjusting the tray in his hands. You came here for dinner, not for a lecture on my life going sideways. Morgan shook his head. I didn't come here expecting anything, Daniel, but I'm damn sure not going to sit here and pretend I don't care. Daniel let out a short laugh, a dry, bitter sound that held years of disappointment. Care? He repeated. His eyes locked onto Morgan's, and for the first time that night, the mask cracked. Where was that care when I needed it? The words landed like a punch to the gut, and Morgan had no defense, because Daniel was right. Morgan's life had been a whirlwind of success. Movies, awards, meetings with world leaders. Daniel's life had been a war of survival. Bills, responsibilities, shattered dreams. Somewhere along the way, their paths had split. And now, those two worlds were colliding. You know what's funny? Daniel continued, his voice softer now. Back in the day, we used to talk about making it big. About how one day we'd be sitting in places like this, talking about all the crazy things we accomplished. He let out a breath, shaking his head. Guess you got there, just not with me. Morgan felt that, deep. Because it wasn't just about success, it was about who they had once been and who they had become. Morgan pushed his chair back, sitting up straighter. Come work for me. Daniel blinked. What? Come work for me, Morgan repeated, his voice steady. Not out of pity, not out of charity, but because I know damn well you're capable of more than this. Daniel shook his head, a mix of disbelief and frustration flickering across his face. Morgan, I appreciate it, but nothing, Morgan interrupted. You told me once that no one gets a second chance. Well, I'm standing here, giving you one. Daniel looked away, his jaw tight. It's not that simple. Why not? Morgan pressed. Because I don't want a handout, Daniel snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise of the restaurant. Several diners turned their heads. Morgan didn't flinch. Then don't see it as one, he said, his voice calm but firm. See it as a chance to prove, to yourself, not to me, that you're still the man who once dreamed of something bigger. Daniel hesitated, because for the first time in years, someone believed in him again. And that was terrifying. Daniel exhaled, running a hand down his face. I don't know if I can do this, Morgan. Morgan leaned forward, his eyes unwavering. You don't have to know, he said. You just have to try. Silence stretched between them. Daniel's fingers tightened around the tray. Hope was a dangerous thing. It had burned him before. Could he really afford to trust it again? For years, Daniel had convinced himself he wasn't meant for more. But now, for the first time, he wondered, what if he was wrong? Part 3. The struggle between pride and opportunity. Daniel Carter had spent years learning to accept his reality. He had convinced himself that life had played its hand and he had lost. that some people were meant for success and some were meant to survive. But now Morgan Freeman sat across from him, offering a different story, a second chance, a lifeline, and it terrified him. Daniel exhaled, gripping the edge of the tray like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I appreciate the offer, Morgan. I do." His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it, a hesitation born from years of disappointment. "But I'm not sure I belong in your world anymore." Morgan frowned. "Why the hell would you think that?" Daniel let out a short, bitter laugh. "Look at me, man. I'm a waiter. I bring food to people who barely see me. Meanwhile, you're out there shaking hands with world leaders and making movies that define generations." His jaw clenched. "We're not the same anymore." Morgan studied him, and when he spoke, his voice was low, firm. "You're right, Daniel. We're not the same." Daniel's stomach tightened. See, even you know it." But then Morgan leaned forward. "Because I didn't let life decide who I was. I fought for it, just like you used to." Daniel's throat went dry, because deep down he knew Morgan was right. Daniel wanted to believe he was beyond saving, that he had fallen too far to climb back up, because if he accepted Morgan's offer, he would have to accept that he had been lying to himself all these years, that he had settled, and that was harder than anything. "Morgan, I don't know how to start over." Morgan nodded slowly. "That's the thing about starting over, Daniel. You don't have to know, you just have to start." Daniel shook his head. "It's not that easy." Morgan's patience thinned. "And why the hell not?" Daniel hesitated. Then his voice dropped to a whisper. "Because what if I fail again?" Morgan stilled, and in that moment he saw it. The real reason Daniel had been holding himself back. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even circumstance. It was fear. Fear of trying, fear of hoping, fear of believing in something again, only to have it ripped away. Morgan's voice softened. "And what if you don't?" Daniel's fingers twitched. "I don't know if I can handle another failure, Morgan." Morgan nodded. "Then let's make sure you don't fail." A moment of decision. Silence stretched between them. Daniel looked around the restaurant, the same place he had spent years pretending to be invisible, and for the first time, he saw it for what it was. Not a life, not a future, just a place he had let himself stay for too long. He looked back at Morgan, who was waiting, patient, unwavering, because this wasn't about charity. This wasn't about pity. This was about Daniel making a choice, to keep sinking or to rise. He swallowed hard. "What would I even do?" Morgan's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Come to my office tomorrow. We'll figure it out together." Daniel Carter stood outside a towering glass skyscraper, his reflection staring back at him like a man he barely recognized. He had spent years convincing himself that his time had passed, that life had carved out a path for him, one that led nowhere. But today, he stood at the doors of Freeman Enterprises, about to walk into an office where he didn't feel like he belonged. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest. Would he be welcomed? Or would this just be another reminder of how far he had fallen? Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped inside. The lobby was sleek, modern, buzzing with polished professionals in crisp suits. The receptionist barely looked up before offering a polite but firm smile. "Name, please." Daniel hesitated for a second before clearing his throat. "Daniel Carter." I have a meeting with Morgan Freeman." The receptionist's eyebrow lifted slightly, but she nodded, typing swiftly. "Mr. Freeman is expecting you. Take the elevator to the 20th floor." The confirmation hit Daniel harder than expected. Morgan had kept his word. This was real. He wasn't being thrown a lifeline out of pity. He was being given a chance, and now he had to decide what to do with it. The ghost of who he used to be. As the elevator door slid open, Daniel's stomach twisted. He stepped into a world so different from his own, it might as well have been another planet. Sleek glass offices, large conference rooms filled with powerful executives discussing things far beyond his understanding. And at the end of the hallway, Morgan Freeman, waiting. Daniel forced himself forward, his steps heavier with every inch. By the time he reached Morgan's office, his heart pounded against his ribs. Morgan smiled as he stood up. "Glad you made it, Daniel." Daniel tried to smile back, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's see if I actually belong here." Morgan gestured to a chair across from his massive desk. "Have a seat." Daniel lowered himself, feeling out of place in the luxurious leather chair. Morgan leaned forward. "I didn't bring you here for you to feel small, Daniel." Daniel let out a breathless laugh. "Could have fooled me." Morgan's gaze sharpened. "You think this is some kind of charity case?" Daniel didn't respond, because in some part of his mind, that's exactly what he thought. Morgan sighed, shaking his head. "Let me tell you something. I didn't bring you here because I feel sorry for you. I brought you here because I know what you're capable of." Daniel met his eyes, skepticism clear. "And what exactly am I capable of, Morgan?" Morgan smiled slightly. "That's what we're about to find out." Morgan reached for a thick folder, sliding it across the desk. Daniel hesitated before picking it up, flipping through the pages. "What is this?" "A proposal," Morgan said. "A business that needs fresh leadership, and I want you to take a look at it." Daniel frowned, flipping through charts, financial records, and company statistics. "Morgan, I haven't worked in an office in years." "So?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "So? I wouldn't even know where to start." Morgan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Figure it out." Daniel blinked. "Excuse me?" "Figure it out," Morgan repeated, "like you used to." Daniel froze, because suddenly he was remembering. Late nights in college, solving problems no one else could, brainstorming business ideas with Morgan over cheap coffee and grand dreams. He had once been the kind of man who didn't wait for someone to tell him how to do something. He just did it. And Morgan? Morgan was betting that he still had it in him. Daniel closed the folder, his fingers tightening around the edges. "What if I fail?" Morgan didn't hesitate. "Then you fail, and you try again." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "You make it sound so simple." Morgan's eyes softened. "It is. You've just spent so long surviving, you forgot what it's like to take a risk." Daniel looked down at the folder, at the chance he never thought he'd get, at the future he had convinced himself wasn't possible. His entire life had been dictated by fear, and for the first time he wondered, what if I stopped being afraid? Morgan had opened the door for him, but stepping through? That was something only Daniel could decide. Daniel Carter stood in front of Morgan Freeman's office window, looking out over the New York skyline that once felt like a world away. He had spent years looking down, at the floor, at dirty dishes in a restaurant sink, at the life he thought he was doomed to live. But today he was looking up. The proposal Morgan had given him still sat on the desk, waiting. It wasn't a handout. It wasn't charity. It was a challenge, a chance to become the man he once dreamed of being. Morgan leaned against his desk, watching him. "You don't have to decide today." Daniel let out a slow breath. "I already have." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "And?" Daniel turned, meeting his gaze. "I'm in." Morgan smiled. "Good. Now let's get to work." For the first time in a long time, Daniel Carter felt like he belonged, not because of where he was, but because of who he was becoming. Daniel thought his story was over, but today he realized it was just beginning. Through this story, we realize that life doesn't define us. Our choices do. Daniel believed that once he had fallen, there was no way back up. But Morgan Freeman reminded him that failure isn't the end. It's the start of something new. Success isn't just about what you earn, it's about who you uplift. Because at the end of the day, true wealth isn't found in money or power, it's found in the people who refuse to let you stay lost.